I was 11 years old when the police showed up at school to tell me my parents weren't coming home. A small plane crash, mechanical failure, no survivors. One day, I had a normal life with a mom who braided my hair before school and a dad who coached my soccer team. And the next, I was an orphan with a suitcase of hastily packed clothes, sitting in a social worker's office. "You're very lucky, Mia," the social worker told me, her voice gentle but clinical. "Most children in your situation would go into foster care, but your uncle has agreed to become your guardian." Uncle Robert wasn't actually my uncle, he was my dad's cousin. But he was the closest relative I had left. I'd met him maybe 5 times in my life at family gatherings, where he'd always seemed pleasant enough, if a bit distant. He was single, childless, and worked as a financial advisor at a firm in Boston. Not exactly the father figure type, but as the social worker had reminded me, the alternative was much worse. "I know this is hard," Uncle Robert said as he drove me to his downtown condo after the funeral, "but we'll make it work, kiddo." His place was sleek and modern, all clean lines and minimal decor, clearly not designed with children in mind. He cleared out his home office to make a bedroom for me, the walls still bare except for the faint outlines where his diplomas had hung. "We can paint it whatever color you want," he offered awkwardly. "Make it yours." I just nodded, too numb to care about wall colors or furniture. All I wanted was to go home, to my real home, with my real parents. The first year was a blur of grief, therapy sessions, and adjusting to a new school. Uncle Robert tried his best in his own way. He hired a housekeeper who made sure I had meals and clean clothes. He attended parent-teacher conferences with uncomfortable formality. He never missed a birthday or Christmas with practical, if impersonal, gifts. What he lacked in warmth, he made up for with financial security. "Your parents were smart," he told me when I was 13, sitting me down for what he called a financial education conversation. "They had excellent life insurance and investments. I've been managing the trust they set up for you." He showed me statements with numbers that meant little to me then, nearly $2 million that would become mine when I turned 25, with provisions for college expenses before that. "My job is to protect this for you," he explained, "to make it grow. That's what your parents would have wanted." I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He was a financial advisor by profession and family by blood. The money was the last thing my parents could give me, their way of taking care of me even after they were gone. Things changed when Uncle Robert met Deanne. I was 15, awkward and introverted, when he brought home the blonde interior designer with a perfect smile and 2 children from a previous marriage. Chloe was 13, Madison 11, almost exactly my age but nothing like me. Where I was quiet and studious, they were loud and social, their designer clothes and carefully highlighted hair making my thrift store wardrobe and unruly curls seem even more out of place. "We're going to be sisters," Madison had exclaimed with rehearsed enthusiasm during our first meeting. I'd managed a tight smile. "Stepsisters, technically," a distinction that seemed important, though I couldn't articulate why. They married quickly, and suddenly the minimalist condo was sold in favor of a sprawling house in an exclusive suburb. My small plain bedroom was replaced with a larger one, professionally decorated in tones of gray and blush that Diane assured me were very now. "Isn't this better?" Uncle Robert asked, gesturing around at the new house. A real home, not just a place to live. I nodded because it seemed expected, but the truth was I felt more out of place than ever. Diane and her daughters operated as a unit, their insider jokes and shared history creating a wall I couldn't penetrate. Uncle Robert, eager to prove himself as a husband and father, increasingly aligned himself with them. Family vacations began to feature destinations the girls chose. Family movie nights showcased their preferences, family dinners centered around their activities and accomplishments. I retreated further into books and schoolwork, finding solace in academic achievement. When I was accepted to Stanford with a partial scholarship, I was ecstatic, not just for the educational opportunity, but for the chance to escape the house that had never felt like home. "Stanford is so expensive," Diane commented when I announced my acceptance at dinner. "Even with a scholarship." "That's what the college fund is for," I said, glancing at Uncle Robert. "Right?" He cleared his throat, not quite meeting my highs. "We should discuss that privately, Mia." Later in his home office, the one room that still maintained the sleek aesthetic of his bachelor days, he'd explained that there had been some changes to my financial situation. but I had no way to verify his claims. I was 17, with no access to the trust documents or accounts. When I asked to see statements, he promised to gather them but somehow never did. Meanwhile, Chloe was driving a new BMW for her 16th birthday. Madison was taking private horseback riding lessons. Diane was renovating the kitchen with imported Italian marble. None of it aligned with Uncle Robert's claims of financial hardship. The partial scholarship covered about half of Stanford's tuition. For the rest, Uncle Robert reluctantly agreed to pay a portion, insisting I take out student loans for the remaining amount. "It builds character," he said. "I worked my way through college, made me who I am today." I wanted to point out that his college had cost a fraction of what Stanford did, even accounting for inflation. But I bit my tongue. I needed what little support he was offering. College became my sanctuary. The growing distance wasn't just physical. Each visit made it clearer that I was an afterthought in their family narrative. During my junior year, I received a call from Mr. Winters, my parents' old family attorney. He'd reached out to wish me a happy 21st birthday. "I've been thinking about you," he said warmly. "Your parents would be so proud of all you've accomplished. Stanford. Just what they'd hoped for when they set up your education fund." Something in his phrasing caught my attention. "Education fund? You mean the trust fund?" "Well, both actually," he replied. "The trust doesn't fully vest until you're 25, as you know, but they created a separate education account specifically for college expenses. It should have more than covered your undergraduate degree, even at Stanford prices." My blood ran cold. "A separate account? Are you sure?" "Absolutely. I helped them set it up myself. It was a 529 plan with about $400,000 in it at the time of their passing. Your uncle, as trustee, would have had access to those funds for your educational expenses." That night, I couldn't sleep. The pieces were starting to align in a pattern I didn't want to see. The next morning, I called Mr. Winters back. "Is there any way to check the status of these accounts?" I asked. "To see what's left." There was a pause. "As the beneficiary, you have certain rights, even if you don't have direct control yet. I'd need to review the trust documents. Robert should have provided you with copies when you turned 18. "He didn't," I admitted. Another pause, longer this time. "I see. Why don't you come to my office next time you're in Boston? There are some things we should discuss in person." 3 weeks later, during spring break, I sat in Mr. Winters' wood-paneled office as he explained the extent of Uncle Robert's deception. "Based on the records I've obtained," he said gravely, "it appears that Robert has systematically diverted funds from both your education account and the main trust. The education account has been completely depleted. The trust, which should have grown to approximately $2.5 million by now, has less than $200,000 remaining." The room seemed to spin around me. "How? How could he do that legally?" "Not legally, I'm afraid," Mr. Winters replied. "As trustee, he had fiduciary responsibilities to act in your best interest. The pattern of withdrawals suggests personal use, large transfers coinciding with the purchase of their home, the girls' private school tuition, luxury vehicles, vacations." "He stole from me," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. "My own family stole from me." Mr. Winters nodded solemnly. "We have grounds for a civil suit, possibly criminal charges. But Mia, you should know that recovery might be difficult if the money has been spent." "What are my options?" I asked, my mind already shifting from shock to strategy. "We file a suit for breach of fiduciary duty. We petition the court to remove him as trustee. We try to freeze what assets remain." And he hesitated. "We gather evidence. Anything that might show his intent or awareness of wrongdoing." As I left Mr. Winters' office, I felt a strange calm descend. The betrayal was so complete, so absolute, that it moved beyond hurt into something else entirely. This wasn't just about money. It was about the final gift my parents had left me, the future they planned for me, stolen by the person they trusted to protect it. Back at Uncle Robert's house, I could never bring myself to call it home. I maintained a careful facade of normalcy. I needed time to think, to plan, to gather the evidence Mr. Winters had mentioned. The opportunity came unexpectedly during a family dinner celebrating Madison's acceptance to NYU. As glasses clinked and congratulations flowed, Diane turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Any plans for graduate school, Mia? After Stanford?" Before I could answer, Uncle Robert interjected. Mia will need to work for a while, pay off those student loans. Real-world experience is valuable. But I thought tech companies often cover graduate degrees, Diane pressed. Madison's planning for an MBA eventually. Uncle Robert's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. We can discuss Madison's graduate funding when the time comes. Her situation is different. Different how? I asked, keeping my voice casual. He shot me a warning look. Financially different. You know that, Mia. Because my trust fund is gone. The words slipped out before I could stop them. A heavy silence fell over the table. Chloe and Madison exchanged glances. Diane's perfect smile faltered. Market downturns affect everyone, Uncle Robert said stiffly, repeating the explanation he'd given so many times. We've discussed this. Right, I nodded. The market crashes. The necessary expenses. Just bad luck. His eyes narrowed at my tone. Perhaps we should continue this conversation privately. Of course, I agreed, noting how quickly he wanted to move the discussion away from his wife and stepdaughters. Later that night, he summoned me to his home office, irritation evident in every line of his body as he closed the door behind us. What was that about at dinner? He demanded. Just curious about the different financial situations, I replied, my heart racing despite my calm exterior. Since we're family and all. Listen, Mia, he sighed, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he used when he thought I was being difficult. I've done my best for you. I took you in when no one else would. I've provided for you. The financial picture isn't what we hoped. But that's life. Mr. Winters called me, I said, watching his face carefully, about my parents' education account. His expression flickered, surprise, then concern, quickly masked. Harold Winters? He's been retired for years. Semi-retired. I corrected. And he remembers the specific 529 plan my parents established. The one that should have covered Stanford completely. Uncle Robert shifted in his chair. That account was folded into the main trust. For better management. And then the main trust was folded into your personal accounts. For better management? His face hardened. I don't appreciate your tone or your implications. Financial matters are complex. You're not equipped to understand the decisions I've had to make. Try me, I challenged. Show me the statements, the transfer records, help me understand. I don't have to justify myself to you, he snapped, mask slipping further. Everything I've done has been for this family. I'm part of this family, I reminded him. Or am I? He looked away, composing himself. When he spoke again, his voice was controlled, almost gentle. Mia, I understand you're disappointed. The trust didn't yield what your parents expected, but focusing on what might have been won't help you move forward. You're getting a world-class education. You have promising career prospects. Many would envy your position. And Chloe, Madison? What advice would you give them if their inheritance disappeared? His jaw tightened. That's different. How? I pressed. How is it different? Because they're my daughters. He exploded, slamming his hand on the desk. My responsibility, my blood. There it was, the truth beneath the excuses and justifications. In his mind, I had always been the outsider, the obligation. The resources meant for me had been redirected to the family he considered his real family. I see, I said quietly, reaching into my pocket where my phone had been recording our entire conversation. Thank you for clarifying. I left his office without another word, the recording secure. The next morning, I flew back to California and sent the audio file to Mr. Winters. Things moved quickly after that. Mr. Winters filed an emergency petition to freeze the remainder of the trust and remove Uncle Robert as trustee. The recording, combined with the financial records he'd obtained, provided compelling evidence of misappropriation. Uncle Robert hired an expensive attorney and tried to frame his actions as reasonable discretionary decisions within his rights as trustee. But the paper trail was damning. Vacations to Europe classified as educational opportunities. Private school tuition for his stepdaughters listed as beneficiary educational expenses. The down payment on their luxury home disguised as investment property for the trust. The court removed him as trustee and ordered a full accounting. Criminal charges were considered but ultimately not pursued in exchange for a settlement agreement. He would repay $1.2 million over 10 years, secured by a lion on his house and retirement accounts. I didn't return to Boston for the proceedings. I finished my senior year at Stanford, graduated with honors, and accepted a job offer from a tech firm in San Francisco. I sent Mr. Winters to court on my behalf, unwilling to face the family that had never really been mine. Uncle Robert tried to contact me several times, calls, emails, even a handwritten letter that arrived shortly before graduation. Mia, I know you feel betrayed, and from your perspective, I understand why. But please try to see things from my side. I never planned to become a parent. When you arrived, my life changed overnight. Then I met Diane and had a chance at a real family. Perhaps I convinced myself that your parents would have wanted to support all of us, to provide for your sisters as well as you. I made mistakes, serious ones. But they came from a misguided place of trying to create a family, not from malice. I hope someday you can forgive me, Uncle Robert. I read the letter twice, then filed it away without responding. His version of events, the well-meaning father figure who'd simply extended the definition of family too far, didn't align with the man who'd shouted that his stepdaughters were his real family, his blood. The man who'd watched me take on student loans while buying Chloe a BMW. 3 years passed. I built a successful career, made genuine friendships, even started dating someone who made me feel valued and seen. The settlement payments arrived promptly each quarter, transferred directly to the reconstructed trust now managed by a professional fiduciary. Then came the invitation to Madison's college graduation from NYU, a thick cream envelope with my name and address handwritten on the front. Inside was not only the formal invitation but a note from Madison herself. Mia, I know things are complicated with our family. I was young when everything happened, but I'm old enough now to understand what my dad did to you was wrong. I didn't know about the trust fund or where the money for our life came from. I should have questioned more, noticed more. I'm graduating next month, and despite everything, I'd really like you to be there. You were the smartest person in our house. The one who showed me girls could code and build things and go to schools like Stanford. I'm majoring in computer science because of you. No pressure. I understand if you're not ready or don't want to see any of us ever again. But I thought you should know that you made a difference to me, even if it didn't seem like it at the time. Madison. I sat with the invitation for days, emotions churning. Madison had been 11 when I moved in, 13 when her mother married Uncle Robert. Just a child, and while she'd been part of the unit that had excluded me, she'd never been responsible for the financial decisions that had derailed my future. In the end, I decided to go, not for Uncle Robert or Diane, but for Madison and perhaps a little bit for myself, to close a chapter that had been left unfinished. The graduation ceremony was standard university fare, long speeches, the calling of hundreds of names, proud families cheering. I sat toward the back, separate from Uncle Robert and Diane, who were several rows ahead with family I didn't recognize. I watched Madison cross the stage, accepting her diploma with a beaming smile, and felt an unexpected surge of pride. Afterward, in the crowded reception area, Madison spotted me first. She hurried over, still in her cap and gown, and hesitated just a moment before hugging me. You came. I can't believe you actually came. Congratulations, I said, genuinely impressed. Computer science at NYU is no joke. I interned at Google last summer, she told me excitedly. Got a return offer for after graduation. That's fantastic, I said, meaning it. You must have really impressed them. As we talked, I saw Uncle Robert approaching cautiously, Diane and Chloe hanging back. His hair had more gray now, and he looked older than his 52 years, lines of stress etched around his eyes. Mia, he said, his voice uncertain. Thank you for coming. It means a lot to Madison, to all of us. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Would you consider having lunch with us? He asked. As a family. The word family still stung, but I looked at Madison's hopeful face and found myself agreeing to meet them at a restaurant near campus. Lunch was awkward, conversation stilted, and carefully navigated around difficult topics. Chloe, now in her senior year at Boston University, talked about her plans to go into marketing. Diane asked polite questions about my job in San Francisco. Uncle Robert mainly listened, speaking only when directly addressed. As dessert was served, Madison cleared her throat. So I have something to tell everyone, she announced. I've decided to donate my trust fund to a scholarship for orphan children. The table fell silent. Uncle Robert's fork clattered against his plate. "Your what?" Diane asked, confusion evident in her voice. Madison met my eyes briefly before continuing. "Dad set up trust funds for Chloe and me when he married you, Mom. I found the paperwork when I was looking for my Social Security card last year." Uncle Robert's face had gone pale. "Madison, that's not." "They're quite substantial," she pressed on, her voice steady despite the tension. "About $500,000 each. Started around the same time Mia's trust fund supposedly experienced those market crashes. The implication hung in the air, unavoidable and damning. "I don't need or want money that should have been Mia's," Madison continued. "So I'm using it to help kids like she was. Chloe can make her own decision about hers." Chloe, looking stunned, glanced between her sister and her father. "Dad, is this true? You took money from Mia to give to us?" Uncle Robert seemed to shrink in his chair. "It wasn't. I didn't. There were complex financial considerations." "Yes or no, Dad?" Madison insisted. He couldn't meet any of our eyes. "I thought I was building a legacy for my family," he finally said, the words barely audible. "I was your family too," I said, breaking my silence at last. Or I was supposed to be. The restaurant continued its normal bustle around us, waiters delivering food, diners laughing at nearby tables, completely unaware of the seismic shift occurring at our table. Diane looked shell-shocked, as if this revelation was as new to her as it was to her daughters. "I'm so sorry, Mia," she whispered. "I had no idea." Perhaps she hadn't. Or perhaps she'd chosen not to look too closely at their sudden financial comfort after the wedding. It hardly mattered now. "I should go," I said, placing my napkin on the table and reaching for my purse. "Mia, please," Uncle Robert began, but Madison cut him off. "Let her go, Dad. You've taken enough from her." Outside the restaurant, Madison caught up to me on the sidewalk. "I meant what I said about the scholarship," she told me, slightly breathless from rushing after me. "I already talked to a lawyer about setting it up." I studied her face, so earnest, so different from the carefully polished 13-year-old I'd first met. "You don't have to do that." "I know," she nodded. "But I want to. It feels right." "What made you look for the trust documents?" I asked. She gave a half smile. "You actually. In my CS ethics class, we discussed a case about digital financial fraud. It got me thinking about what happened with your trust, how easily Dad explained it away. So I started digging. I felt a surprising burst of pride. Good for you." "I'd like to stay in touch," she said hesitantly. "If that's okay, not because we're family or whatever. Just as people. Friends, maybe." The word family had been weaponized against me for so long, used to justify taking what was mine, then to exclude me when convenient. But standing there with Madison, I realized that perhaps there were connections worth salvaging from the wreckage. "I'd like that," I found myself saying. "Friend sounds good." 1 month later, back in San Francisco, I received notice from Mr. Winters that the settlement payments from Uncle Robert had been accelerated. He had sold their house, downsized dramatically, and liquidated investments to pay off the remaining balance in full. Attached was a note, unsigned but clearly from Uncle Robert. "It's not enough, but it's a start. No excuses this time, no justifications. Just acknowledgement and action. The trust fund, now fully restored and then some, sits mostly untouched. I don't need it for daily expenses. My tech career has been lucrative enough. But knowing it's there, secure and protected as my parents intended, brings a piece I hadn't realized I was missing." Madison and I video chat monthly. She's thriving at Google, her scholarship fund for orphan children taking shape with professional guidance. Chloe eventually decided to donate half of her trusts to the same cause, keeping half for graduate school, a compromise I respect for its thoughtfulness. Uncle Robert and I don't speak directly, but occasionally he sends brief emails with articles about trust law reforms or financial protections for orphan children. It's his way of showing he's trying to understand the magnitude of his betrayal, I think. Not for forgiveness. We're well past that, but for his own redemption. Sometimes I wonder what my parents would make of all this. The betrayal, the lawsuit, the fragile new connections formed in the aftermath. I think they'd be proud of how I protected what they left me. Not just the money, but the self-respect to demand justice, and the discernment to differentiate between those who wronged me knowingly and those who were caught in the crossfire. The inheritance that matters most wasn't in the trust fund after all. It was in the values they instilled, integrity, perseverance, and the courage to stand up for what's rightfully mine. Those, thankfully, were never Uncle Robert's to steal.